is this long piece of information here about Victor Lewis, who is like very accomplished and very wonderful. It's about IRBs.
Okay. You guys hear me okay? Okay. So what I want to do in the next 25 minutes is talk about what IRBs do, why they do what they do, and the fact that you actually should look at the Code of Federal Regulations once so you know what's in there, because so many people will tell you what's in there who have never read them. They're actually pretty well written. So these are my financial disclosures. I do work with and for various consultants in my academic life and lots of clients, and I'm lucky enough to got support from various areas from the NIH. So the way we oversee clinical trials, and we're going to be talking about two different aspects of this, is largely the product of history. So in World War II, there were tremendous abuses of human subjects, although certain countries are particularly noteworthy for this. In fact, there were multiple different countries that participated or conducted experiments or programs that abused human subjects without consent. And this really caused tremendous outcry after World War II. This led to a couple of different events and texts. The Nuremberg Code was the first place in which the importance and value of consent of human subjects was captured, although it had been talked about earlier. And the Declaration of Helsinki is the place in which this concept that there should be independent review of the scientific merits of research and the scientific basis for that research. Another very famous experiment is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which was initially an experiment with the natural course of the disease, which may or may not ever have been ethical, but at the time it was designed, there was not an effective treatment. And then when an effective treatment became available, it was essentially not disclosed to the subjects who were participating. And as you now know, there's now specific regulations that talks about the requirement to disclose to someone participating in a research study about any new developments or changes that might affect their desire to participate or continue participation. The Belmont Report, which occurred later, established three basic ethical principles that underlie our current conception of how we protect and treat fairly human subjects in research. They are respect for persons, the fact that each individual should have control over their own destiny and participation when possible. Beneficence, which is this concept of doing good. And I put in here versus non-malfeasance, which is a term that often comes up. They're different. Non-malfeasance is just do no harm. Beneficence is actively doing good, trying to provide benefit to the individual or to the class in which the patients exist. And then justice, the idea that those who bear the burden and risks of participation in research should also be the people or the group or the category of persons who benefit from that research. So we shouldn't do research on all you people over here, but the group over here who actually can afford the treatment that's developed actually benefit from that. And the goal here, this is a cartoon from the New Yorker. I use it in almost every talk I give. The goal here is to hurt as few people as possible as we move science forward. The process of research is to improve the care and the outcomes of patients on the future horizon, but we're using people today in order to do that, and we should hurt as few as possible. The point here, which seems to be that being a placebo group is bad, is in fact not true. Being a placebo group is often the optimal group to be in a clinical trial, given that you heard yesterday that virtually nothing in neurology works. That's what's my take on it. Okay. There were a number of different places that regulations intended to protect human subjects were codified or captured, and there was developed something called the common rule. The term common here implies that it applies across multiple different federal agencies or research contexts, specifically those funded by NIH and those governed by the FDA. They're codified in two different parts of the law. There are some slight differences, but there's a lot of commonalities in this term common rule. 46101, so this is 45, that's the big section, the big volume, Code of Federal Regulations, section 46101. You can look any of this up. And it's actually very short text, it's easy reading, and it's really important to understand where the terms that will be bandied about by your IRB really come from. So the first is 101, to what kinds of activities do these regulations apply? All research involving human subjects conducted, supported, or otherwise subject to regulation by any federal department. According to this law, these regulations don't apply to non-federally supported research. But almost every institution that you're affiliated with has entered into a federal-wide assurance that says no matter who supports our research or if the research is unsupported, we will still abide to the rules that apply to federal research. That's what the assurance says. So these rules apply to all research that you do. Now, if you're doing research in your garage, unaffiliated with any institution, not something I would recommend, I'll be clear on that, technically these laws would not apply. You're a university, if you're a university employee, would not see it that way. What is research? Research is any activity designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So a common question that comes up is, when does a QI project require IRB review? As soon as you intend or think you might intend to create generalizable knowledge, generalizable usually means outside of your institution, that is research. So if you do a QI project and say, and I'm hoping to publish it, that's research. And don't try to get into this game with the IRB of saying, I didn't really plan on publishing until I saw how good the results were, and now I'm thinking of it. Most IRB people have heard that story too many times. A human subject is identified as a living individual with which you have interaction, either to collect data, or for whom you have identifiable or protected health information. Interestingly enough, once you're declared dead, you are no longer a human subject, which has created all kinds of interesting problems with the regulations around experiments intended to improve the yield of organs from organ donors who have been declared dead. There's actually a hole in the federal regulations. I think it's interesting. And the compliance with the regulations is enacted or is carried out by the Institutional Review Board, which is really a fascinating thing. The Institutional Review Board is a local group, at least as originally envisioned, that understands the local context of the patients, the cultural sensitivities, the history of the institution, language barriers, and that sorts of things. And the idea was that the interpretation of these regulations is inherently a local phenomenon. The IRB shall have at least 5 members with varying backgrounds. IRBs need to have lay members by law. And the idea, kind of like the jury, is that this represents a variety of expertise and perspectives. So there's a belief in the wisdom of the group. And the IRB is supposed to review research, review the consent form and consent procedures, and conduct something called continuing review, which is to look at the projects periodically as they're being carried out to make sure that they continue to meet their standards for the ethical respect of persons involved. There are, in the regulations, detailed descriptions, concise but detailed descriptions of what the IRB is supposed to do. And if you look at what your local IRB requires, it's tied very directly to these regulations. This is why, by the way, when you argue, you shouldn't have to answer a question. They just look at you with that blank face. It's because it's actually federal law that says you do, and you're not going to get very far. There are, however, categories of research through which the IRB can have an expedited or easier, faster, simpler review and approval process, and those are captured by this website. The easiest way to find this is to go to the Office for Human Research Protection's website, that's on hhs.gov, and just search expedited. And they update this list. This is the thing that says if you're using only non-invasive sensors, or you're using only educational tests, or you're using only blood obtained through heel sticks, that those kinds of research activities can be approved more easily by the IRB. There are several concepts in research that's of low risk that are important to understand because people often don't understand it. One is the term minimal risk. How many of you, if I didn't have the definition in front of you, think you could explain what the regulatory term minimal risk means? Okay. I don't know if that's because you know that I will call on people. Okay. Usually people think it is. So minimal risk is defined as the risk that occurs with normal everyday activities of normal people. So almost with every example we have of the trials we've been talking about, the patients enrolled in the trials are already incurring more than minimal risk. So arguing that your research is minimal risk because the person already had devastating head injury and what you're doing doesn't add much more risk, that actually doesn't meet the spirit of what the minimal risk definition was intended to do. The other category of research that can undergo expedited review is the continuing review. So a year later, you tell them how many patients you've enrolled, what's happened, they can very quickly approve that without going back to the full committee to go. Okay. So what does the group actually talk about? It's very hard to find a picture of an IRB on the web. I think it's because they're all secret. They don't want you to know who they are. This is not what an IRB looks like now, because there's almost never any paper. They're all over the computers. And I don't know if they're, well, I'm not saying probably they're just browsing one. Okay. So what are the criteria for approving a trial that the IRB has to apply? These are the criteria. So when you fill out an IRB application, there's commonly a question that says, explain how the risks are minimized. And you may think to yourself, that's a weird way to phrase that. Okay, that's because the rules say they have to document how the risks are minimized. And they're trying to answer exactly the regulatory requirements. They need to demonstrate that the risks are reasonable relative to the expected benefits and knowledge to be gained. The benefits may be to the individual subject, to the class of subjects, like everybody with acute ischemic stroke, or to the value to society of the knowledge that will be gained. The greater the prospect of benefit to the individual versus the class versus knowledge in general, the more risk that is okay. And that's captured very clearly in the regulations governing research in children. They want to know that the selection of subjects is equitable. So everybody has equal both access to or risk of participation in the research. They want to know that the informed consent process, they want to know who the subjects are, whether you get consent from the subject from a legally authorized representative, which is different often than who you can get consent from for clinical procedures, or if you're going to use the emergency exception from informed consent, which is a very particular part of the code for research in persons who have an unexpected, sudden, catastrophic illness for which there is no known effective therapy, and if that illness makes them unable to participate in the consent process. The little letters I put over after each little thing was my abbreviation for remembering which part of the Belmont report each one of these addresses. The risks are minimized as beneficence. The selection of subjects is equitable as justice. The informed consent process is tied to respect for persons. So every one of the regulations is tied to a core ethical principle within the Belmont report. Documenting the informed consent, how it's documented. There is, for example, types of survey research in which the greatest risk to the subject is their identity being recorded on an informed consent document. And the IRB will actually say you need to get verbal consent, but don't have them write anything down because that actually, if you're doing a survey study on injection drug use and you want honest answers, maybe the best thing to do is not have anybody write their name on something. Okay? Monitoring of study data, privacy and confidentiality, protection of vulnerable populations, and absence of coercion. And often a very problematic area in the sense that people will see this differently is what is coercive. So if I go to somebody who is extremely well gainfully employed and I pay them $10 to have their blood drawn, for the inconvenience of having their blood drawn, that may not be coercive. It may actually have no effect at all. This exact same value of a monetary compensation to someone else in a different part of life may be highly coercive. We once reviewed a study in which healthy persons, they were not patients, were supposed to undergo a right heart catheterization for purely research purposes. And the question is, what is the right level of compensation for their time and inconvenience that is fair, but is not basically paying people to take substantial risks. And figuring that out is very difficult. And IRBs have really, I think, moved away in general from monetary compensation for participation in research because of this question of what's coercive. There are general requirements for informed consent in 46116. It lists what are the elements that have to be in a consent form, which ones are optional. When you look at the informed consent document template in your institution, you will find it basically is this language. It also tells you that there's some subjects, some areas that cannot be eliminated, maybe, for example, the alternatives to treatment, to participation in the study. And therefore, you asking for that to be removed is probably not a good strategy to take with your IRB. And then the documentation there. So I urge you just once to actually pull this up on the web and scan through these things so you see where these terms come from. It does two things. First of all, you know what your IRB personnel are talking about. And number two, when I go in and I talk to an IRB person or our administrator, I just want to be a record, he's actually a wonderful person, and I say, I think this actually does meet the criteria for minimal risk. If I actually know what the definition is, I have credibility. If I'm just making it up on the fly, like some physicians tend to do, okay, then I am being disrespectful of this area of the law, and I lack credibility, and I have zero probability of getting out of that office with what I want. Okay. I'm going to move here a little bit to research involving children. This is important both because it's different than adults, it's a model for protection of vulnerable populations, and it explicitly demonstrates the balance between risk, tolerable risk, and the prospective benefit to the individual. So an IRB may approve research that involves children under the following conditions. Under 404, research not involving greater than minimal risk. So if there's no risk to the child beyond what they incur in their everyday life, that's okay. And that's independent of whether there's benefit to the child. Okay. So that's what actually allows you to do survey research in children. Right? It doesn't benefit the children to fill out your survey, but it's okay because there's minimal risk. Research involving greater than minimal risk, but presenting the prospect of direct benefit to the individual subject. That's the category under which, for example, research into new chemotherapeutic agents for children who failed first-line therapy for malignancies would fall. There's substantial risk to that child, but there's a prospective individual benefit. Research involving greater than minimal risk and no prospect of direct benefit to individual subjects, but likely to yield generalizable knowledge, that comes from the definition of research, about the subject's disorder or condition. That's why it's okay in certain circumstances to do early phase research in children with serious disease. 407 is a fascinating category. Research not otherwise approvable, which presents an opportunity to understand, prevent, or alleviate a serious problem affecting the health or welfare of children. So this is where the benefit accrues to a very, very large population, not to the individual, but because the potential for good for the entire population is felt to balance out the risk to the individual. And then 408 talks about the requirements for permission by parents or guardians and for assent by children. Anybody want to tell me the difference between consent and assent? Say it a little louder. Yes, so consent is actual permission for the child's participation. Assent is, and I'm just rephrasing what you said, assent is informing the child or a person who does not have the authority or the right to consent for themselves about the research. And the idea is that when they give assent, they're basically saying, I understand and it's okay with me, but it's not consent because them saying it's okay would not actually give you permission to do it. The only person who has that authority is the legal guardian or the parent. When you are getting consent for a therapeutic procedure in routine clinical care, say in an emergency situation, do you talk to any adult that's there with a child? So for example, if the aunt is taking care of a child, and they come into the emergency department and the child needs an LP, and do you talk to the aunt about the need for the LP and get their consent? Oh my God, this doesn't happen to you? You don't. What do? You keep it a secret from the aunt? You don't do the LP? Oh, no. Okay. Well, at least where I work, parents are frequently not reachable. What do? Yeah. Oh my God, guys. You talk to the aunt. Why is that okay?
Parents have put the aunt in charge of the children.
Yeah, the aunt is the most reasonable person, and your motivation in doing the LP is presumably with the child's best interest at heart. So you are not inherently conflicted. I'm ignoring professional billing for a second. Peculiarity of the American medical system. Okay? And the aunt is a reasonable person. You certainly wouldn't do it without talking to the aunt, because that seems to be the person that, for whatever circumstances, has been put in charge of the child. Can you get research consent from the aunt for a research procedure? Do you know? So the answer is generally no, and of course it's a must they are a legally authorized representative, which includes, among other things, guardians. It includes judges if the child is a ward of the court. Okay? So guardian is a narrow term, legally authorized representative is a more general term. And the reason there's a higher standard for who you can talk to is because in a research setting, you have a vested professional interest in getting your referral. And so the assumption is that you have a conflict of interest, and someone with a higher level of authority needs to be able to give consent in addition to the child's assent. You made the comment about assent. Did you say 11 and above? Okay. Yeah, so it's very institution dependent. It depends on the complexity of the research. So something that has very little benefit to the child, but is pretty simple, we actually have assent processes down to age 7. Okay? So we're going to put a little sticker here. This thing's going to go like this. You have to hold still for a few minutes. If it's a high-risk procedure, the assent may only be used at 13 and above. And if it's something that's very invasive that has the direct benefit of the child, there may be no assent procedure. They're not going to allow the child to not give assent for rescue chemotherapy. Okay? For example. So it's very long. Yes? You've never seen an industry-sponsored trial involving children in assent. So I'm sure that's a truthful statement about your experience. I don't know why the IRB would have a lower standard for the involvement of children in their own destiny for an industry-sponsored versus an academic trial. The last industry-sponsored trial I did that involved children, we had a whole set of consent forms. So there's nothing in the regulations that would make that distinction. So that would be a good question for your IRB administrator. Okay. Now, one of the things that has happened with IRBs has to do with centralization. So I made this comment early on that the original vision for an IRB is that it incorporated and understood local values. What are the local issues with your populations, language barriers, religious beliefs, prior experience or attitude towards research. And that local representation of the community was a huge part of protection. It also was a source of tremendous inefficiency. If you're doing a large multi-center trial, you would go to 40 IRBs, get 40 different opinions on what the consent form should look like, 40 different opinions on exactly who should be eligible or excluded from the trial, and it was impossible or it was incredibly inefficient. So one of the things that has changed is this idea that there should be a central IRB that approves the study overall, a standard consent form that then may have minimal customization for the individual sites. There is a bunch of these central IRBs. And the NIH and other funding agencies are increasingly insisting on the use of central IRBs, because if you're a funding agency, whether it's federal, foundation, or industry, it is horrible if you devote money to a project and there's a long delay in startup and it fails to accrue its intended sample size, and it's tied to this regulatory approval process. And there was little evidence that the individual variation among IRBs was based on true differences between the risk and the community, and it just seemed to be based on personalities on the IRBs. So the goal of central IRBs is to leverage repeated experience with the protocol to increase the efficiency and consistency of the review process. So you're the first site that goes in to Word, you may get a lot of questions. When you're the 28th site, they know the protocol better than you do. It's most useful in the initial approval. It's less so for ongoing monitoring, because they often don't do monitoring very well of the experience of each of the individual sites. There's some variation in that. They're not very good at appreciating local considerations. They don't know what percentage of your population speaks different languages unless you tell them. And I will just say they vary tremendously in quality. There are central IRBs that feel like rubber stamp organizations. And so most institutions have a list of the central IRBs that they are willing to work with, and those in general are AHRQ certified, the accrediting organization for human service protection programs. Okay. So successful interaction with your IRB depends on a couple of things. Understanding the IRB. Read the regulations once so that you actually know what the terms mean, so you're not making up stuff. Understand their purpose and role, their composition, and the regulatory requirements, and really build trust and respect. I cannot tell you how many interactions with both young and old investigators I have that go something like this. The other person says they're so, put in your word of choice, we're really unhappy because the IRB insists on X. And I ask, well, sometimes I think to myself, that's because X is required by law. Sometimes I think to myself, and what I try to say is, well, did you meet with Liz, who's our IRB administrator, to ask why they're insisting on X? Oh no, I'm writing this nasty memo. God, they just don't understand, my area of science. Did you talk to Liz? No, I'm writing my second memo. Okay, no one has ever won a pissing match with Liz. Okay, it's not going to happen. Okay? And if you just go and talk to Liz and say, I understand that I need to follow the rules, help me figure out how to fix this mess, whether it's a consent form that's was poorly completed, or the witness wasn't right, or I forgot to get assent, or I used the wrong consent form, things will go well. Okay? So, the IRB's administrators are human too. And the time you spend to show that you understand the world in which they work, what the regulations mean, their responsibilities, and you have respect for that, and want to work with them to meet the requirements, the better your life. Thank you very much.